Hello, my name is Laura Knutson, and I am the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, Community Involvement Coordinator for the Portland Harbor Superfund site. I wanted to take a few minutes today to share some high-level details with all of you about one of the action items from EPA's Portland Harbor Community Involvement Plan, or CIP, which is providing an informal feedback opportunity for community members at the sweet spot of early remedial design for each project area, so that feedback may influence the final design of the cleanup. This video is intended as a guide for working parties who are being overseen by EPA at each project area, so they can, 1, be aware that this early design presentation is an expectation of EPA, and 2, understand how your early design presentation as a working party fits into the overall informal feedback process, and 3, so you can start thinking about what your early design presentation could look like. So you can begin asking me or your EPA remedial project manager any questions you might have. Please note that you will also see that these slides say living document for continued review discussion. And that is because we will continue to update and revise this process and these slides in collaboration with community members, working parties, and others as these informal feedback opportunities start. So to start, I want to take a moment to explain why EPA has an expectation that working parties will provide an early remedial design presentation at a sweet spot. While providing information about the remedial design process to the community members who are directly affected or interested in the cleanup work is an EPA best practice, for Portland Harbor, it is also written into EPA's Portland Harbor Community Involvement Plan, which is a document required by the Superfund law. This slide shows several places in the EPA Portland Harbor CIP where this expectation is clearly outlined. You can find a link to the full EPA Portland Harbor CIP in the video description below. Next, I just want to go over quickly the main groups involved with this informal community feedback, and they are outlined on this slide. First, we have the working party or parties who are for each specific project area, and they will be the ones presenting the early remedial design core presentation. EPA, as a regulatory agency, we are the ones who are actually considering any feedback that is received by the Willamette River Advocacy Group, or RAG, which holds the EPA Technical Assistance Grant, or TAG, and the RAG currently has the technical advisor to interpret technical documents for the Portland Harbor Superfund site. And then also community members. So the RAG works to get input from and feedback from, and also inform community members who are impacted and affected by the Superfund site. So those are the key people in this process. Additionally, we want to share the overall steps of the informal community feedback process for this early remedial design phase and how a presentation fits into this structure. So for whatever phase in the remedial design process that your EPA remedial project manager, who in connection with me, has determined makes the most sense for incorporating informal community feedback, in most cases, that will probably be the draft basis of design report phase or the draft 30% design phase. EPA would first share a draft of that early design document with the Willamette River Advocacy Group for potential comments from the RAG's technical advisor in collaboration with other interested and affected community members. And then we also most likely would post it or share it with other community members for questions, only that they would then work with the RAG to provide to us. And additionally, performing parties, after the document has been shared, would share a presentation, which is what we're talking about today, on that early remedial design stage, and engage in a question and answer session. And this would be supported by EPA. After that, the facilitator, third-party neutral facilitator, will prepare a meeting summary to capture the discussion highlights, and we'll share that with EPA, with performing or working parties, and also the RAG for reference only. Then informal feedback may be received by EPA from the RAG, as I mentioned, and we will share that with working or performing parties for reference only. And lastly, informal feedback from the RAG will be reviewed by EPA. So EPA, we are the ones who are reviewing that feedback, and we may, depending on the comments, incorporate that feedback as our own comments back to the working parties. And we will plan to, as in a feedback loop, follow up with the RAG at a collaborative meeting or other meeting as needed, perhaps a community advisory group meeting or a RAG meeting, to talk about what comments we decided to move forward and which ones we did not. Moving on, we just want to quickly mention that for each early remedial design presentation, EPA does intend to provide an introduction at the very beginning that will provide clarification that informal community feedback is first and foremost intended to be provided by community members only via the RAG. So this is specifically outlined in the CIP. It's also intended to offer more transparency. It's very helpful if it's succinct and clear. The feedback that we receive from the RAG or in the Q&A session during the presentation. And it's also more useful if it's tied to realistic objectives. So at the beginning of this presentation, part of the outline that you'll see in a second is to have EPA clarify some of this, such that one of the main things on here I want to highlight is that this is about remedial design. This presentation, it's not about focusing on remedial action, because no agreements we recognize have been signed for remedial action at this time. Lastly, I just want to quickly run through a proposed framework for the early remedial design presentation, and then just give a few suggested tools and recommendations for the presentation. So a suggested framework or proposed framework would be for, as I mentioned, that EPA RPM, Remedial Project Manager, to provide an introduction on what I just said, kind of setting some framework and information about the project area, and then introduce the working party representatives. Additionally, then the working party or parties that would transition to them to provide an overview of the current status of remedial design and go into a little bit more information about then what the design would look like as well. Then additionally, one piece that EPA could also support this section with the working parties, and we can do a lot of preparation for this as well, is how will this design work impact nearby communities? And one thing from the Portland Harbor Community Involvement Plan, and we have done some trainings in Portland on this recently, is perhaps incorporating an EJ, Environmental Justice Screen review, which is an EPA tool, as part of this presentation, and kind of just walking through that with folks. And then additionally, just talking about how this design addresses other areas of community interest, and EPA can help in collaboration with community members kind of prepare working parties for that section as well, for questions as well that may come up in this piece. And then lastly, EPA can provide a conclusion. So moving on, just some of the tools that working parties could use in their presentation. Showing the project area in a visual way has worked very well in the past, such as using Google Earth as a tool, sharing live links that participants can easily access, using easy to understand language, so avoiding technical terms and acronyms, and providing visuals as well. Also, this is something that EPA can help with as a recommendation for the presentation, is explaining the presentation timing. Why is this presentation being given at this phase in the project? Again, using examples and easy to understand language, and focusing on flexibility and adaptability of the design. Also, just kind of some general best practices, keeping the presentation to 30 minutes if possible, so relatively high level, saving a lot of time for discussion and questions and answers with people who are interested. And just also FYI, we would hope to schedule a dry run at least a couple months, ideally, in advance of the actual delivery of this presentation, at least one, maybe two, so that we can make sure it's the most useful for everyone. That being said, in summary, we'll be reaching out, as EPA to working parties at all project areas to coordinate on these early remedial design informal feedback presentations. But if you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to contact me via email. It's knutson.laura@epa.gov, which is on the slide, or via phone at 206-643-4299. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to working with you on your early remedial design presentation.